Hey everybody, it's Rabid. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be comparing the free-to-play tank-based games with 15 vs 15 matches, research trees, upgrades, crew skills, premium vehicles, silver currency, and gold currency, World of Tanks, and War Thunder. Now, anyone who's only been with the channel for about the past year or so would know me mostly for my War Thunder content. However, the very early days of the channel, I did actually make some World of Tanks content. The problem is that was several years ago, so in order to get a fresh perspective on the game, I decided to log back in and see what I could do. Now, when I logged back in, there was a special package for the Batchat 25T that included a Sisters of Battle skin, and that seemed like a win-win, so I could grind my way up to this tier 10 vehicle, and in the process I could get an idea of the current state of the game, the upgrade systems, how they've changed, and how they affect the current gameplay. While I was at it, I also decided to pick up a few other vehicles, both to get an idea for other types of gameplay, and also just to provide some more variety with the gameplay in the background. Additionally, I decided that going through the War Thunder French tech tree would also get me to a similar vehicle, the Char 25T, and provide a useful point of comparison versus how the Batchat and the Char actually work in both games. Now, before we can do any real comparison, we have to ask ourselves, what exactly are we comparing? There are currently 3 versions of World of Tanks, a PC version, a console version, and a mobile version, and there are also 2 versions of War Thunder, a PC and console version, and a mobile version. Comparing the mobile versions would be a little awkward, so we're going to stick to the PC and console versions. The most common version and game mode for each game: for World of Tanks it is the PC version and the random queue, and for War Thunder is the PC/console version and the ground realistic battle mode. So that is what we will be comparing for the duration of this video. However, it is important to note that both games have quite a few different game modes, so if there are aspects of them that you like but other aspects that you don't, it might be worth checking out some of those alternative game modes just to see if those fit your fancy. And this also brings us to the first major point of comparison, in that in World of Tanks it is fully crossplay, so depending on which systems you and your friends have, it might be a better pick. Although if you are just playing it on your own and looking for a way to pass time, both of the games basically serve the same purpose. This brings us neatly to our next point of comparison, and that is the types of vehicles available in both games. World of Tanks is fairly simple in that it is exclusively ground vehicles, and by and large it is tracked ground vehicles with very few wheeled vehicles in the game right now. Currently there is a British wheeled medium tree and a French wheeled light tree, and other than that every vehicle in the game is fully tracked. It's also important to note eras in that World of Tanks goes from the 1920s to about the 1960s plus or minus. This much narrower focus on terms of types and era of vehicles means that in order to fully flesh out tech trees, there are a lot more experimental vehicles in the game, and you should definitely expect that. In terms of War Thunder has a much wider array of vehicles, including naval and air vehicles, and it also covers a much wider spectrum from about the 1930s to literally the 2020s. Some vehicles in that game are entering production basically as we speak right now. In this respect, War Thunder does have a much broader array of vehicles and doesn't have to lean as much on experimental vehicles, so you will see a lot more authentic vehicles both in the matchmaker and in the tech trees in general. It's also important to note, and you'll see this as we go into gameplay, that World of Tanks has a very fine focus on exactly how vehicles are supposed to interact with each other, whereas War Thunder kind of doesn't. And that means even vehicles that might otherwise fit World of Tanks, you won't really find in the game because they simply don't fit within that formula, whereas War Thunder can kind of include pretty much anything and make it work, at least to some extent. Obviously, if there is a specific vehicle that would be a deal breaker for you personally, whether you or a family member served alongside that vehicle or you just really like it, you should definitely check to see if it's in the game before you start it up. And this neatly brings us around to our last point before we start up with the actual gameplay comparisons. Both of these are free-to-play live service games. As far as the player population, both of them seem to be pretty healthy. I was able to get matches within about 30 seconds pretty consistently across both games, so in general I didn't notice any issues with the player population and problems with matchmaking. Additionally, these are live service free-to-play games, so mechanics, vehicles are constantly being changed, added, new game modes are being tweaked, that kind of stuff. So some of this information may be out of date if you're watching this very far in the future. Now, in terms of gameplay comparison, I like to work my way down from the smallest elements to the largest elements, because it turns out the moment-to-moment gameplay is what's going to affect your positive or negative feelings of the experience, especially if it's a game like this that's a live service game that you'll probably play on and off for a few years. So we're going to start out with the most basic element, and that is the movement. Both World of Tanks and War Thunder use the appropriately named tank-style movement controls. That is to say, forward and backwards moves you forward and backwards, whereas left or right to turn you instead of strafing you like it would with most first-person shooters. And this is also where we get to one of the more interesting differences between the two games when you start getting into things like wheeled vehicles. The British wheeled medium tanks behave exactly like a normal tank in that they even spin in place. However, the French wheeled light tanks, if you don't press forward or backwards and just press to the left or right, it will actually turn it in a very tight circle. In War Thunder, this is very different. All turning left or right does without pushing forward or backwards is it turns the wheels to the left or right, so that when you do push forward or backwards, you will get a tighter turning arc. So that is a minor difference between the two games. Another much larger difference between the two games is how it handles turning while moving. So in World of Tanks, it feels like the tanks were on rails, and I couldn't really put my finger on exactly why, and then I realized they kind of are on rails. So what happens is when you turn while moving, the vehicle automatically takes a turning circle that is appropriate to maintain your speed while moving. So you are kind of on rails. It won't let you just fly out of control or lose all of your speed by turning the wheel too tight. This means in practice that in World of Tanks, if I were to put you in a giant parking lot, you could simply maintain your speed indefinitely because there's no obstacles or anything slowing down, or that you have to slow down to turn inside of, which is kind of an interesting difference, especially compared to War Thunder, where War Thunder will let you just skid into a building or off a cliff if you turn the wheel too tight while moving at high speeds. In fact, moving at high speeds in War Thunder can be somewhat difficult to maintain control of the vehicle, especially some of the heavier vehicles that have a lot of mass, as that mass and weight will make it more difficult to maintain control of the vehicle, or at the bare minimum will make it difficult to maintain your speed while turning. Of note, in terms of mobility characteristics of individual vehicles, both games handle it a little differently. World of Tanks plays a lot more fast and loose, looking for good gameplay experiences, and they've already admitted several times that characteristics such as reverse speeds are often completely fake just to make for a better gameplay experience. War Thunder, on the other hand, goes with authenticity, even if that authenticity is very annoying or very tedious to play. This means that War Thunder does focus on things like gearing ratios for vehicles a lot more than World of Tanks that has very similar gearing ratios. It's not really an issue, but it also means that War Thunder has amazing reverse gears that go as low as 4 or 3 kilometers an hour in some cases. That is just painfully annoying to play. In the clip in the background, I am reversing at the maximum speed this vehicle is allotted, and as you can see, it is not terrifically fast. Both games also handle effects of things like terrain quite differently as well. In World of Tanks, terrain is handled on an individual vehicle basis, with each vehicle having their own set of terrain modifiers for different types of terrain. In War Thunder, terrain modifiers are universal to a type of vehicle, so all wheeled vehicles will perform incredibly well on surfaces like concrete, but incredibly poorly on surfaces like mud. As a bit of a side note, World of Tanks doesn't really like putting incredibly soft terrain modifiers on, say, an entire map. It'll usually only be on select parts. Conversely, War Thunder is actually okay with this, and this led to a rather hilarious moment when they introduced a bunch of new snow maps and realized that most vehicles couldn't actually perform very well on snow, so they had to rework all of the terrain modifiers for snow for basically every class of vehicle, just so these brand new maps weren't complete crap to play on. As far as special terrain effects like ice in World of Tanks, it doesn't really do anything. It's more like just a giant parking lot. There are limited time modes wherein ice will actually cause vehicles to slip and slide, but generally speaking, it's basically just normal hard ground. War Thunder treats ice as, well, ice. It's difficult to accelerate, it's difficult to stop, and it's difficult to change direction. However, these are not generally in parts of the map that you actually need to go on, so it is kind of an optional mechanic. As far as water features, deep enough water features in World of Tanks are effectively impassable. If you go deep enough in the vehicle, you get a counter. When that counter reaches 0, your vehicle will just straight up be destroyed. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. In War Thunder, it handles the drowning mechanic a little differently. You still get a timer when your crew is submerged in water. However, it is very notable in War Thunder that when the timer is up, only the crew members that are actually fully under the water will actually take damage. This can get you in scenarios where only the crew in the hull is actually taking damage and dying, whereas the crew in the turret are fine. However, in War Thunder, you have to have a driver and you have to have a gunner. So if your driver is killed, somebody will move from the turret to take his place, and usually the driver is in the hull. This can lead to scenarios in very rare instances where you can actually get enough mobility between crew members dying and replacing each other to back yourself out of the water feature. However, this is kind of rare, and it can also lead to scenarios where teammates can potentially help and pull you out of the water, which again is kind of rare. Most of the time, this does basically function the same as the World of Tanks mechanic, in which once the counter reaches 0, you're probably just going to die. Additionally, War Thunder does feature a number of vehicles that can just float in the water, so they can just drive in and be perfectly fine. However, it is notable that there is a difference in the amount of turbulence you'll encounter in the water between, say, a nice serene lake and the open ocean. And for maps that have open oceans, a lot of the amphibious vehicles will actually struggle to keep above water enough to not drown, which is kind of interesting. And that seems like a nice segue into how both games handle collision with terrain features. In World of Tanks, if you collide with a terrain feature going fast enough, or if you fall off a cliff going fast enough, you will take damage. Now, the amount of damage you take depends on whether or not you're able to land on your tracks. For example, if you were to take a relatively large fall, but you were to land on your suspension and your suspension absorbs all of it, you won't take that much damage. Conversely, if you were to flip and land on your turret, well, you're probably going back to the hangar. Additionally, in World of Tanks, if your vehicle is flipped and you don't have any way to unflip yourself, the game will give you a 15-second timer, and if you've reached the end of that timer and you still haven't been able to move, the game will automatically deploy you right side up. War Thunder doesn't generally have collision with obstacles as a major factor, and also doesn't have any falling damage. However, you can run into weird scenarios where if you hit an obstacle going fast enough, you can break one of your tracks, or in this particular instance in the background, I lose both my transmission and my driver because I hit a rock going particularly fast, which is something I have never seen happen before or since. Which also brings up the point of War Thunder is kind of inconsistent. In fact, that's the most consistent part of the game, is that it is inconsistent, and we're going to see that multiple times throughout the course of this comparison. As a bit of a side note, both War Thunder and World of Tanks add artificial weighting to the bottom of a vehicle, so it is actually kind of difficult to flip it unless you're rolling down a hill, and you will generally right yourself unless you're taking a pretty extreme or pretty quick maneuver. And this seems like a good time to bring up the tow cable mechanic in War Thunder, and it doesn't really have an equivalent mechanic in World of Tanks. What this is you can attach a tow cable to either any wrecked vehicle or any friendly that has specifically requested assistance, and then you can attempt to drag either the wrecked vehicle or the friendly vehicle. You can use this to kind of drag friendly vehicles out of positions where they're stuck in. You can use this to try and help vehicles that are capsized. You can also use this to drag friendly vehicles that have been immobilized in the line of fire, or in this scenario, you can use it to help a teammate up and then throw a tow cable to them so they can help you up. Overall, it is just an interesting and versatile mechanic, and this seemed like a good time to bring it up. Now, all of that is all well and good, but to give you some real examples of how this translates in the gameplay, here we have an example from the Watt Replays website. This is the player 2 unique in the mouse. Now you can see the mouse actually moves and accelerates reasonably well, despite the fact that it's 180 tons. In fact, it's accelerating so fast you can see it rock on its suspension when it's moving forward and backwards. This is kind of indicative of World of Tanks and the way it handles mobility in general, because broadly speaking, vehicle mass isn't a huge factor, and it's mostly just the hard stats of top speed, power to weight ratio, etc. that actually dictates how a vehicle moves. Now we're going to move into the War Thunder video of a mouse, and you can see this is a lot more sluggish. Getting up to its top speed takes forever. Turning basically kills all of its speed. It doesn't even move anywhere near fast enough to rock backwards on its suspension, and it's more like a moving house, whereas the World of Tanks version was more like just a big heavy truck. Moving from one of the slowest vehicles to one of the fastest, this is General Hans 98 in the EBR, also from the Watt Replays website. You can see the vehicle turns, accelerates incredibly well, and basically only ever loses speed if the player wants it to lose speed or if it's hitting some kind of obstacle. In this respect, the EBR handles very easily. Now, if we look at the same vehicle in the game of War Thunder, you notice a massive difference in terms of the vehicle's automotive performance. It doesn't turn or accelerate well at all, especially if it's trying to do any kind of maneuvering. Additionally, here's an interesting trivia question. Which vehicle is faster, the EBR in World of Tanks or the EBR that you see on screen right now in War Thunder? The answer is actually the EBR in War Thunder. It has a maximum speed of 110 kilometers an hour. However, as you can see in this clip, we're barely breaking 60 because we're moving across sand, which is obviously something that a wheeled vehicle like the EBR doesn't like. And then again, who does like sand? But this does also illustrate the point that even though a vehicle in War Thunder may have a high top speed, things like its ability to cross terrain and its acceleration can often be a much more important factor, whereas in World of Tanks the game is much happier to give you big open fields that you can drive vehicles at their top speed, basically without restrictions. And that concludes this episode comparing World of Tanks to War Thunder. Now, one thing I realized very quickly is that if I were to put it all together, it would be a very long video, and doing that in one sitting isn't really all that viable. However, I did want to do it, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to release the videos episodically and put that in a playlist, but I'm also going to make a supercut as I go with these kind of endings and beginnings removed so that you could watch it all together as one basically feature-length movie if you really wanted to. And that's going to conclude our video for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you had fun. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. That always helps out the channel. As always, don't commit to shoes.